The enlargement of liberty for individual human beings must be the supreme goal and the abiding practice of any Western society. The first element of this individual liberty is the freedom of speech, the right to express and communicate ideas, to set oneself apart from the dumb beasts of field and forest. Each time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance.
28 past the hour. Then Senator Robert Kennedy discussing the importance of free speech during a trip to South Africa in 1966. But almost 60 years later, the New York Times editorial board is warning that the right to free speech in America still faces a serious threat. In a new piece, the board writes in part, quote, "For all the tolerance and enlightenment that modern society claims, Americans are losing hold of a fundamental right as citizens of a free country. The right to speak their minds and voice their opinions in public without fear of being shamed or shunned." How has this happened? In large part, it's because the political left and the right are caught in a destructive loop of condemnation and recrimination around cancel culture. Wow, this is a big conversation to have. Joining us now to discuss even further, founder of the conservative website The Bulwark, Charlie Sykes, and host of MSNBC's Politics Nation and president of the National Action Network, Reverend Al Sharpton, and chief executive of PEN America, a free speech organization, Suzanne Nossel. She's the author of the book Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. And thank you all for joining us this morning.
So, Reverend Al, we've talked about it for some time. You've talked about latte liberals. You've talked about the woke culture that's disconnected from large segments, even of the Democratic majority. Talk about this Times piece this past weekend and illiberalism that many see on the right and on the left.
I found it a fascinating piece because I think that at one hand, to say that we should speak out and go after people that say misogynist or racist or bigoted things is one thing. But we've gotten to the point now where if you even disagree with what is considered trendy or what is considered right by either the far right or the far left, all of a sudden you're canceled. And that gets very close to banning free speech and free expression. If you cannot have debate, even in the civil rights community or the women's rights community or in political circles, where it's my way or no way, then we are not fighting for freedom. We are, in fact, inhibiting freedom. And I think it's gone too far on the fringe sides of both the right and the left.
So, Suzanne, I'll go ahead and give an example of this that I don't think many people on TV have. But you sit around the dinner table, even with academics, and they will talk about the swimmer at Penn and the trans swimmer at Penn. And then they'll start saying, okay, well, is that fair to young girls that grew up swimming? And I said, well, why don't you have this discussion in your classrooms? Oh, we couldn't have this discussion in our classroom. Well, why don't you have this discussion on we couldn't have the discussion on television. And so even putting that issue aside for another day.
No, why can't we have the discussion?
When somebody wants to have that discussion, talk about how there are stories like this where you can only express one side of the conversation or be canceled by polite society.
Yeah, look, it's a great example of a discussion that's really hard to have right now. And that's partly because, look, transgender people are only becoming more accepted, more established, more recognized in society. They have, steep hills to climb, face enormous discrimination. And so, their notion is any questioning of their identity and their participation is sort of an affront to their right to exist. And at some level, you can understand that. On the other hand, I think many people feel as you do that this is a tough issue, that there are equities on both sides, that there's no perfect solution, and we ought to be able to talk about it. And so, where I think we really lose our way is just the vitriol. And you see this even in response to the Times piece. Look, some of the aspects of that piece may not have been phrased perfectly. I think the way they used the term right was a little ambiguous. Is this a right vis-a-vis the government, as in the First Amendment, or kind of a right in a more of a social sense? But people just went after that, and we sort of lost the thread of being able to engage with, what is a real struggle, as their numbers in their survey illustrate.
And you'll have people on both sides getting very angry, I'm sure, at this segment saying, oh, you're preaching this moral equivalency where there's not one. But, we could go left, right, left. Charlie, we could look at college campuses, which it's very funny when people act as if this has just happened, because I remember being in law school, writing to my teachers left-wing views. I remember being an undergrad, understanding if I said something conservative in the classroom at University of Alabama, my professors would roll their eyes. And so this isn't anything new, but we also see it, though, on the right. We see it with why don't they just have book burnings in certain states? It's insanity. And there is illiberalism on the right, just as there is illiberalism on the left. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, look, you don't have to say that they are morally equivalent or that they are the same thing, but the reality is that both sides are responsible. You have a two-front war against liberal democracy and free speech. And I think it's important to recognize that. And this has been going on a very, very long time. Look, I mean, the Times piece, I think, overstated the problem by saying we had a fundamental right not to be shunned, but it also understated the problem because it's not always about just being shunned. It's also about losing jobs, losing contracts, people who are shouted down on university campuses. And I guess my real fear is that the consensus in favor of tolerance and free speech is much thinner than perhaps we imagined that it was. And that if both the left and the right basically have decided, nah, we're not that interested in it, we are going to shut down the people that we, in fact, disagree with, then we really do have a challenge. And I think that at this particular moment where we're seeing this sort of worldwide confrontation between liberal democracy and autocracy, this is a good debate for us to have at this particular moment.
It's a great debate, and I love the fact that a column on free speech generated so much free speech. I see that as something.
Fantastic.
I see that as something healthy. People shouldn't be fragile and frail. We should have this talk. But here are a couple of insane examples that, again, happened 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, I guess. Condi Rice was going to speak, I think, at Rutgers, and they had petitions, drove her out from speaking. And then Christine Lagarde, driven out from speaking at a commencement address. And you just sit, but that insanity continues on college campuses especially. And you just sit back and wonder, who's in charge there? Who's allowing students to determine who's going to be speaking at commencement ceremonies when they're canceling people like Christine Lagarde and Condi Rice?
Yeah, and I think college campuses is a real focus of this. And the notion of safe spaces has become, actually, we cannot criticize anything or have an open discussion about anything. It's gone beyond what it was originally conceived of.
It's actually not safe. That sounds dangerous.
And that sounds dangerous because actually you want to have kids, at college exposed to different points of view. I mean, the problem is that as we are living in a society that is changing quite rapidly, this demands nuanced conversation, and social media is a nuance-free zone. You cannot have...
Katie, we're not going to ask about your children, and I'm not going to talk about my children, but what I've heard from their friends and what we've heard from kids on college campuses are that they're afraid to talk in class. And it's not just one of them, it's all. You get 5 kids around a table that go to prestigious universities, and they will tell you they can't raise their hand in class and say anything controversial, because if they do, they'll get attacked. It'll go up on social media. and their social life at that campus will be destroyed.
Yeah, and it becomes a kind of mob rule on social media, right? It's not actually a discussion about different points of view because social media doesn't allow for that. But, you know, I wanted to ask Reverend Al, because the critics who are saying that actually if you criticize the notion of cancel culture, if you say that this is a real problem, you're actually talking about a power transfer. This is not about freedom of speech. This is about the majorities being afraid of sharing power, and that's where the kind of liberal anxiety, and it's, you know, white liberal anxiety about cancel culture comes from. Do you think, Rev, there's something to that, or is there a distinction to be made between freedom of speech and power sharing?
I think it definitely is a distinction that should be made. Freedom of speech means that we have an exchange of ideas, we can debate it out. And a lot of it comes down to whether you sincerely believe what you believe and say you believe, so you therefore are secure enough to debate it. When you have to cancel people from even having the discussion or the debate because they don't agree with you, my first thing is to suspect that maybe you really are not that firm in what you're saying. Let me use, for example, where Joe talked about Condoleezza Rice being canceled from appearing at a campus. I disagreed with most of what Condoleezza Rice did as Secretary of State, but I had her on Politics Nation, my show here on MSNBC, because I'm secure in what I believe. I'm prepared to debate and talk to her about what she believes. But if I've got to shut her up and shut her down in order to win my argument, do I really believe in my argument?
Yeah, it's a great point. And Suzanne, I want to use what I consider to be a pretty extreme example of this. And since this is a New York Times article, and so glad the Times did this, but it was the New York Times, I guess a couple of summers ago, that fired their opinion page editor because he printed a United States senator's op-ed piece. Now, I was offended by the senator's op-ed piece. 56% of Americans supported it, his position. He was a United States senator, and yet the Times fired him because people inside the newsroom were offended. It struck me as concerning. I'm curious your thoughts about this sort of culture inside, not just the Times newsroom, but in many newsrooms.
Yeah, look, I think there is a great fear of where the red lines lie, and even those in positions of authority, the publisher, I think initially was willing to stand by the editorial team that made this decision. You know, the editorial hadn't been read by the senior most person, and maybe that was a problem, but to send the message that, you know, even an error can lead to firing and dismissal, I think put fear in the hearts of editors everywhere that one mistake, misjudgment might be career-ending. And I think if we want our editors and publishers to take risks, to put forward alternative perspectives, to really offer us a breadth of views, you know, that's a dangerous way to operate. And I think we can absolutely debate whether that was a sound editorial decision, but that kind of swift dismissal leaves a chilling effect, and that's what I worry about. I also worry about a rising generation that has become unmoored from the idea of free speech, believes it's a smokescreen for hatred, believes those who purportedly defend it are just hypocritical. And so if we lose young people when it comes to the bedrock principle of free speech, I think the underpinnings of democracy get undercut.
Charlie, that is a concern. It's such a concern that I will say children, because I'm such an old guy now. But children that I see going off to college, young adults that I see in college, they can't say what they want to say in college. And there are other young students in college who see, as Suzanne said, who see speech as free speech as an affront to their right to live in this safe zone. It's an un-American. It's just an un-American thought. We, in our generation, we were allowed to say really stupid things in classroom. Everybody was. Not just white guys. everybody sitting around were free to say stupid things in class.
Or not
be
stupid,
corrected.
exchange ideas.
No, let me say stupid things in class, be corrected, learn from the mistakes that we made, see our blind spots, and hopefully become better people and more critical thinkers. That I'm so fearful that we're going to raise a generation of students that can't be critical thinkers because their worldview is never challenged because it might offend their sensibilities.
Oh, the Charlie's frozen.
Charlie
is so horrified.
He said, you know what, he's uncomfortable with what you've said, and he's decided to leave.
I've just been canceled by Charlie. Go ahead, Charlie, if you heard everything.
I think we're already there. I mean, this notion somehow that you have a right not to be offended has become deeply ingrained. Look, if people who do not want to encounter ideas that make them uncomfortable, they should go to a monastery, not a university. But you know, one of the things that's really troubling is watching what's happening at even some of the elite law schools, where you have students at Yale Law School shouting down a speaker, which makes you wonder what kind of lawyers are they going to be? What kind of judges are they going to be? What's going to happen when they're in the courtroom and they hear somebody challenging their arguments? Again, this culture has become deeply ingrained. Look, I mean, I also think we ought to acknowledge, you know, that there should be some red lines. The question is where they are applied. Right. I mean, there are some people. I mean, you know, there's no fundamental right to spread disinformation or lies about about science or about about a number of other things, or engage in bigoted speech. But it is this intolerance which demands which demands a conformity that I think is the most troubling. And again, what worries me is watching both the right and the left engaging in this kind of behavior is that we used to have a consensus, or at least I thought we had a consensus, but I think that consensus is much more fragile than we ever imagined. I'm trying to imagine which political figure in America could give the speech that Robert F. Kennedy gave that you played at the top of this segment. Who would be willing to say that?
A lot to work on. Charlie Sykes, Suzanne Nussel, thank you very much. Reverend Al, we'll see you again a little later in the show when we speak with Senator Dick Durbin. Also,
hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news, or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.